Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Kraus. I am the Director of Product Management here at Worksoft, and I'm going to talk about Agile. Maybe sometimes I do Agile, maybe sometimes not. I think it's interesting. Shoaib talked about how people are moving to Agile. Paul Gerard gave the statistics saying, hey, it's been around 18 years, and we're still on the journey to that. And the nice thing is people always talk about Agile as a journey, right? And so the topic today, Agile, maybe sometimes it's realistic. Some people are waterfall in parts of the organization, some people are Agile. But the thing is, it's really not well understood. They always say Agile DevOps, or Wagile, or Agile Fall, right? But just, if we want to say, what is the spirit of Agile, right? And so I'll kind of separate that from DevOps, like the tooling that the developers love, versus Agile, how do we actually do planning and get increments out? So let's break down the work. How does DevOps get the code to production? QA in the new Agile DevOps world. What is an N+1 when we actually talk about automation? And then end-to-end testing in the new world. The Agile Manifesto. So this is what happened. There was that team of people, and they sequestered away, and they said, individual interactions is better than process and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. So don't give me 400 pages of documentation, give me something working and we'll build upon it, right? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. That never happens, right? Responding to change over flowing over a plan. So Agile basically said, let's actually put the business first. And what it did is it allows a whole part of the organization to align to that. It wasn't just the people writing the apps or maybe configuring SAP, Salesforce, things like that. It actually goes through security, the CSOS office. It talks about desktop support. It's like, how can everybody work together to support the business? So it's a good way to correlate and bring people together. At the highest level, we have themes, we have epics, and we have stories. So if you use Jira, you use Rally, maybe IBM Rational, Panaya, you'll see that most people follow this. Solution Manager, if you add the plugin for Agile, you'll get similarities to these, right? At the highest level, the theme is something that management sets upon, and then epics are major pieces of functionality, and then stories is how we break them down. Now, what's interesting is when you actually get into Agile, you realize there's actually something in the middle called a feature. And a lot of times that gets lost because people are looking at their story cards. When you go to Agile training, they say, here's your 3x5 card, your story's on the front, the acceptance criteria is on the back. A story can be, I need to process overtime for hourly workers. I need to process overtime for regular workers. I need to process overtime for holiday, right? Well, those three things actually work together as a feature called overtime, right? And there's just different flavors of overtime, okay? And that rolls up into a larger epic, migrate the payroll system from SuccessFactors to PeopleSoft and support a change here, right? So a lot of times we step back and we get so myopically focused on the stories, and in fact there's acceptance criteria, we forget there's that middle layer, which is how stories get grouped together. And we're gonna come back to this multiple times. It's really important for us in the automation world. Okay, Agile development is a philosophy, right? And as Paul Gerard cleverly pointed out, the figure 8, when you straighten it out, looks like the waterfall with the loop. But the big thing is we talk about, can we actually take, instead of an 18-month deliverable or a 1-year deliverable, can we deliver smaller chunks along the way in an Agile way? And as customers of Worksoft, you've noticed we've started doing this. You get monthly releases of Certify. You get every 2 weeks a version of Execution Manager. Sometimes BPP, always analyze. So we're taking features and we're rolling in chunks out smaller. But we still do the same things. We need to do some analysis. We plan to develop, we test, we release. But the goal is those stories or those features are something that's consumable by the user. So that's where the Agile Manifesto comes into. We want to focus on, can we get something to the business? I mean, they don't need to worry about holiday pay unless there's a holiday, but we always need to worry about getting the features for overtime out first, right? So that's how we kind of do our Agile planning. And obviously it's a very contrived example, so it works. I'll give you that. So when we think about that, our stories, the cool thing is on the left side, you have your product vision and your backlog. You prioritize that. So we're going to do overtime for hourly people first. We'll do overtime for salaried people next because they don't get anything. And then we'll do the holiday pay third, right? Because that's a variation of that. Now, when you're doing agile planning, that can be 3 different teams doing that, right? It doesn't matter the teams are doing it. You're just planning your stories, and then the stories come in, and we start doing the sprint backlogs. We take the stories for work, we push them on the right. So ideally, we're going to use analyze and capture to start capturing those stories. We'll use certify for the automation, and then obviously execution managers to start running the automation after it's ended, right? So we want to get into this rhythm of how can we build the automation and how can we run it on a very regular basis. And that will actually mirror up to our agile deliveries. Now, this is something to take into account. Traditionally, Agile was always in the smallest, most simplest apps. So think about the Uber app. They really didn't do anything. GPS and maps were already on my phone. PayPal payment systems were already on my phone. All they did was use existing functionality, APIs, if you will, and mashed up a simple app called Uber. Supply, demand, you're in the same geographic location, I pay you, right? There was nothing phenomenal about that. It was just a change in business process. Well, of course, those people doing simple mobile apps, because APIs exist in the background, they're like, of course we're agile. We can write all our tests. This works magically. Dude, you're probably not doing very much. Those applications were lipstick on a website. They're lipstick on a mainframe kick service, right? Now, when it comes to SAP, that's a totally different thing. So I say, when you're building a house, that's like building a simple app. When you build a house, you have a plan. Guess what? We have agile planning. You have a blueprint for that. Water exists, power exists, gas line, cable, and internet exist. No one's living in the house. You start building the house, and when it's done, you hook it up to the services, APIs, if you will, and you move in, and you're happy. Well, you cannot do that in an SAP, right? When you upgrade SAP, maybe you move to a new ERP package. It's like rebuilding a city. You can't just shut off all the power to the city to reclaim it. The roads have to work. The power has to work. You know, you have to keep the city running while you upgrade it. And that's what we do when we're upgrading these major ERP packages, right? We're keeping the business running while we're reclaiming the city or while we're upgrading. So it's a lot more complicated. So I think it's a great analogy to tell people, hey, when you do Agile in these big SAP things, it's not 3 simple stories of mashing up something like building a house. It's a lot more complicated. There's a lot more things that go into it. So that's where actually thinking about my themes, my epics, my features, and my stories come into play. Because a lot of times our features are a correlation of how things work together. Because in the perfect Agile world, stories are in any order possible. Well, guess what? That's not the case in the real world, especially when you're rebuilding the city. You don't want to like repave the roads before you change the water lines. There's an order in which those things happen. So there's an order that happens when we actually do these major reclamations. So this is where the release train and the scaled Agile framework comes into play, right? So the concept of a release train is we have a high-level business process order cache, and there's multiple moving parts. There could be some new web applications where they're making the orders visible to the user, maybe on a mobile device. You've got new devices, maybe using Panaya to schedule your work and your SAP, things like that. You've got major pieces that need to be coordinated. So the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe, has the concept of a release train, which means there has to be coordination against multiple stories to create a feature, and then that's what we roll out in a group. So yeah, it's true, Facebook, does 10,000 updates a day. Amazon does multi-thousand updates a day, okay? But if my Facebook post doesn't go in and my nephew doesn't see it, if you screw up the sales to order process for your company, someone's gonna notice, right? Bad things happen, right? So what Scaled Agile Framework does is it allows us to say there's lots of moving parts, and let's have some governance or some coordination across that, because we're rebuilding the city itself. Okay? Now, an interesting outcome of this is F5 Networks did a study and said, what is happening with Agile and DevOps? And what it's doing is actually creating a lot of standardization out there. They say 55% of people are orchestrating their automation. And this could be like your DevOps pipeline, automated testing, provisioning of environments, any type of automation out there. 49% of people are in cloud delivery, 47% are in application development, and 41% are actually exploring new environments there. But what was correlating across that is it was bringing a lot of standardization. We're trying to use the same databases. We're trying to use the same infrastructure to do things, the same security patches. So the good thing about DevOps and people adopting it, the F5 survey said, is we're driving a lot of standardization out there, a lot of tool standardization itself. So good things happen there. Now, how does Agile affect the roles and the responsibilities in the organization? So Paul Gerard talked a lot about just generically how does testing need to change their thinking from I'm a tool person. In my perspective, the first thing we do is figure out how do we discover the process. So where do the business people come into play? Well, the idea is your three amigos, your developers, your business analysts, your QA, those guys are working together, and they're going to describe what my stories are, my features. And then what we want to do is start our end-of-sprint documentation. So when they finish their stories, they want to document it's done. So you may have developer unit tests, but maybe use analyze and capture to document the process this is working, okay? And then we want to handshake that to the automation experts, because I honestly believe there is a lot of value in automation experts. They think about negative tests. They think about how things work together, right? And when you're in a sprint team, you're always thinking about my acceptance criteria, is it done? Acceptance criteria. They don't look at things holistically. They don't look at end-to-end business processes, okay? And then we go over to what happens when you run your automation. So this is where we talk about, 1 + 1 = 3. If I do a capture and I get business process documentation, you can tell management, we have 40% of our processes documented, okay? The automation team use that as a jump start to start building their automation. They extract the data so they know what their data looks like. And then when they run it and they get their BPP reports, you have the validations, and then you have your compliancy reports in BPP, like Sarbanes-Oxley. So one capture gave me 3 deliverables, so you get value there. I know that's the first time you've ever heard 1 + 1 = 3, and it made sense. One capture, I get my documentation of the process, I get my automation, that in turn tells us my BPP reports for the business. So it actually can happen, believe it or not. Okay, cool thing here. Cardinal Health actually bought into this. They started with a very ambitious goal that they wanted to make automation, I'll make it bigger, everyone's job. They wanted to start the journey by embracing the culture of automation early and often. So we started this journey with them, and one of their big upgrades, where they actually said, okay, we're gonna put capture in the business user's hands, and we're gonna go agile with this big Manhattan project. So what does that look like? So continuous delivery is equal to or greater than continuous testing. I don't know what that means, but all I know is I did a cool webinar with Diego at Forrester, and he came up with this graphic. He said, really, continuous testing is wrapping every part of the life cycle. Because once you build one component, you want to continuously test it to make sure nothing breaks. Some people come at unintended consequences. He said, really, testing is no longer a phase in waterfall. Even though we can unwrap this and say it's waterfall, it's actually continuously happening every day, okay? The other thing we found is the modern COE is very federated and flexible. People used to say, we pass in waterfall, here is my in processes, please test for 3 months and let me know I can deliver. Well, now that actually happens all the time. And the 3 amigos, the QA, the business developers, are actually distributed across your sprint teams, right? So Rich Wall just did a presentation about the modern COE and that, and it is really very federated. Like people are, they're keeping best practices centralized, but they're putting the QA people out in the field with the developers. Because in honesty, developers aren't good testers. They're just not. They think differently, right? And this is something that's totally vetted by my client advisory board. They all agree. The other factor we have to realize is there are so many changes happening, like Shoaib mentioned in his slide, kind of looks familiar. QA becomes a mission critical to ensuring we're remaining up, because QA is now monitoring changes versus being the gatekeeper for them. We can have quality gates in our waves and sprints, and our scaled agile framework, but in reality, there's so many changes, a lot of times you will not know that something's changing in Azure in the back end. You may not know about all the security patches that are happening. So having your tests running continuously to flag if things have failed is really key for your continuous monitoring. So what does that look like? If we put Worksoft in our Agile sprints, so we've got 3 sprint teams there. So one sprint team is working on overtime for salaried employees. And then maybe 2 sprint teams have stories about overtime for hourly employees. Because we all know in America, Florida, California, and that's in the middle, do not have the same employment laws. So that is actually multiple stories there to create that one feature of we want to pay overtime, right? So they're going to work on sprint 1, and they have a deliverable. And then we go to sprint 2, and we grab more stories, and we have a deliverable, right? But the trick in Agile is those sprint teams, technically, they're supposed to turn over the card and say, my acceptance criteria is for a salaried employee in California, my overtime, it gives me flex time to take a vacation. They turn over the card. My salaried employee in Texas, overtime means bupkis, okay, right? So they're just focused on that very myopic thing. How do those things work together? So let's think about stories are very unique. Tests are very specific to that behavior of the story, so they're very unit-oriented. And sprint teams are very autonomous. They may not be talking to each other because they already had their high five and said, we're using Git, we're writing in Java, we're using Angular 2 for the UI, and they run away, right? So because they're worried about their own velocities and that. The problem is you can have some defects out there. So let's not repeat developers' mistakes and be too autonomous in our testing. Let's think about our end-to-end testing. Let's think about feature testing. Okay, separate tests are okay, but sometimes they have to come together, especially to help you with test data, right? Okay, and then Uber tests are unmanageable. Yes, you're going to get some crazy developer who writes the magic class that solves everything, but as Rick and I just discussed in our previous thing, having 3 or 4 tests is fine. Maybe you need a test for California, the middle, and Florida. Maybe you need a different test for North America and South America's business rules are different, right? It's okay to have multiple tests. Let's not try to shove everything into something that becomes untestable, which would be the very developer way to do it. So what do developers do in Agile? Well, in DevOps, they do what's called continuous integration. So continuous integration means I've now tried to make sense of multiple people working independently by having source control. I check it in, and then it compiles, and at the end of the compile, I can see 2 people made a change, you broke the build, I can say you 2 broke the build, go fix it. Or 1 person made a change, you broke the build. And hopefully, in the perfect world, they're doing unit tests. If my developers in the room, really, you're doing unit tests, right? So, but not always, right? There's sometimes they just write code and they don't test anything. That's part of continuous integration. Now, continuous testing, this is where we get to save the day, right? So if we are talking about building tests that match these stories and features, and we're running them all the time, as those builds happen, maybe we run the tests once a day, maybe we run them every other day. What happens is we're narrowing the scope of the number of changes. The worst thing that happens is you develop for 3 months and you say test. No one remembers what changes they made over the last 3 months. No one knows if 2 stories broke each other. But if you're doing it in a smaller amount of time and continuously testing, okay, what changed in the last 24 hours? You can probably figure that out on a Friday. You'll never know what that was on a Monday, right? But on Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, the last 24 hours, you'll know exactly what changed. So it makes it easier to identify the problem. Mean time to identification. So that's where continuous testing comes to play. But now how does that fit into the model? Well, obviously you've got developers cranking out code, and then you've got our continuous testing on the right. How do we get the tests for what they're doing? That's the hard part, right? Because developers are always thinking about individual stories. They're not thinking about, am I breaking other things? If they break someone else's code, they probably don't care. They don't know. It's not part of their velocity to do that. Who was responsible for quality? Obviously, the Federated COE who understands end-to-end business processes, who's aligned to one of the 3 amigos, the business, it's their job to understand that, okay? So I'm going to give you a very practical way to approach that. We know that you have sprints, and you have sprints in which you're building code, and those give you stories. And then what I say is after you've done that, if they've used Capture to document those processes, You now have captures and documentation and data that you give to an automation team. And those automation professionals need to start building your proper automation for that. Because remember, developers use stubs and mocks, they use fake systems, so sometimes they don't know if they've broken things. Where QA, we're all about the real thing, right? We want the real systems working. And this is going to be an iterative process. So my assertion to you, and we've proved this at Cardinal, that you can actually take and give a sprint team, the business analyst, to say, business analyst, you have to sign off on the functionality that it works. So I'm going to give you a gift. Here is capture. In the new visual capture, you're going to capture your documentation, and it's going to create a PDF document or Word document. You can say, I accept this. I used a positive scenario, I used a rainy day or negative scenario, I've created the documentation, and I sign off the system is working as I expected. Okay? Now, developers may write their unit tests, but a lot of times, to do our little tests, we may not have all the data, right? Because if it's an hourly versus an hourly employee versus a full-time employee, is it a holiday or not? We may not have all that data when we're writing the stories, but at least we have an example of the expected behavior. We know what's going to happen. So I'm going to suggest that you use analyze and capture in Sprint to document that. And then what happens is, how do we actually get reuse? So the good thing is Certify is going to automatically help you with finding objects and windows and actions. When you import those captures, that happens automatically, right? But then we want to start looking at common navigation. Are we going through the same parts of the application the same ways? Okay? We want to separate data from the input. So within the new capture listing, we can say collapse activities. Are we all doing the same activities? Or we can say we're doing the exact same steps. And if multiple people are doing the same steps, we actually can extract the data into CSVs and load them into record sets. So we're actually building all the tools and analyze to help you do this automatically versus eyes on the glass. Okay? So what is this new automation sprint that you talk of, Chris? Well, ideally, if you've got lots of stories, you've got an automation sprint. These are your QA experts. They may be federated, but then there's some people who are looking at these, and they're going to have a backlog of stories, right? And what they're going to say is, I have a story that talks about overtime for salaried and for hourly people, and then 2 weeks goes by. Oh, I now have the story that talks about the overtime for holiday pay. Well, those three things together complete a feature. So what I'm suggesting is your stories get to feature completion. That is the perfect time to start building your UI automation. Why? There's no WIP. There's no work in process, so there's no redoing of it. So you wait in an extra 2 weeks. It's not the end of the world. What it does is it allows you to do so many more powerful things. If you think about automation of the business process equal to features, right? So we build a backlog, and we say, once a feature is complete, the stories are done, we have all the captures, we then import those into Certify. So what do we want to do? We want to do some evaluate and consolidate. So this is where we're going to use capture listing and say, hey, everybody's using a common login. Okay, check, write one of those. Everybody's got a common logout, check that. Maybe they have common tile navigation and the Fiori screens. The helper classes for sales orders are common across all these test cases. So this is where our automation experts shine, right? Because they start seeing patterns in how the UI is working. They see consistent things. The new capture listing will show you activities and test steps themselves, right? They then think about, how's my data consolidate? You know, I have to have an employee who's hourly to be able to do this test. I need to have an employee who's salaried to do this test. And I need to go to the database and update to make Tuesday a holiday so they get holiday pay, right? All those type of things that QA think about that development doesn't care. I wrote a stub, I wrote a mock. They're all employees to me, right? So those are what we're doing when we talk about consolidation. Then it comes to the just good old Certify. Let's do the automation itself, okay? So actually, how do we import these? We start doing the duping of them. We use the term variabilizing. We create our record sets, all those things, right? So the classic things we do in Certify to make sure the tests work. Now the trick is, if we've got multiple steps, QA people understand, like I said, you have to have an employee that meets these things. We need to have a calendar that has has a holiday so we can test those calculations. So all that type of stuff and the processing is happening along the way. Then here's the trick. If you don't have some type of federated COE, center of competency, I don't care what you call it, you gotta have something, because those guys are gonna be the responsible for scheduling the continuous testing. Because when your continuous test fails, someone has to be responsible to say, oh, a change happened last night, I'm not sure what happened, but this is not a false failure, this is a real failure happened and we had something break another part of the process, right? Maybe they just focused on Texas employment law, now they added the employment laws for California, then they added Florida and South America, right? So something broke along the way. This is key. No one tests for that and thinks about that in sprint. Developers think about unit tests. They don't even have a database, right? They don't have a UI. They're just doing a calculation that, 40 hours times $1.25 is this. 40 hours times 1525 is this, right? They're just doing those small atomic tests. The center of excellence is still very important because they're gonna start tying these together. They become the people responsible to schedule these in Execution Manager, or they're gonna create their really cool playlists in Management Studio and call them from Jenkins to run, or they're gonna call them from ADO, maybe from Panaya, right? Those guys are still responsible for the end-to-end business process. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems when it comes to this end-to-end process. When you talk about end-to-end process testing, Yawanda talked about this very elegantly earlier. She talked about how she's got different lines of business, and then there's business testing and IT testing, and QA has to talk to all those business people. So if you think about order management, delivery, warehouse management, transportation, or you think about the hire to retain workflows, I didn't say the F word, hire to retain workflows, right? Different people do the hiring, different people do your annual reviews, right? And then the easy one is in manufacturing. Sales order clerks know nothing about warehouse management, and they certainly don't care about how transportation works, right? So the QA and the Center of Excellence, so you have to go wrangle those business people together and say, okay, how do we actually create the order that goes through the system? And what's the output of your test that becomes the input to my test? And what's the output of your test that becomes the input to the transportation? Then once I transport it, then I can actually do the invoice and I can reconcile, right? And you talk to accounting, reconcile. So that's a big thing. So when you think about what does QA do all day? Well, they do all the hard work. And a lot of it is getting the data flows, and they have to talk to multiple subject matter experts. And this is something that we talked a lot about at Cardinal. It's like, how do we handle enabling those QA people? Remember Paul Gerard had those skills, like you have to be able to talk to people, you have to, all those things? Well, yeah, they have to go talk to multiple business people and draw the mental model that the data moves across, and then have the soft skills to go talk to them to build that end-to-end process. So I guarantee you that's not gonna happen in a sprint on the back of a card with acceptance criteria. So that's where we see Worksoft playing in. So I call it N+1 integration, where the idea is I have test artifacts in sprints, one story being built, that goes into the queue for the automation team, then the next team finishes the feature, so 3 or 4 or 20 stories, and then they take those for automation, it removes the WIP, it allows you to correlate the input to the output to the test, set up the data, so you actually get to correlate to your end-to-end processes themselves, okay? So, cool, that's my story, and we've got about 10 minutes for questions. And so I'll open it up to the floor. I saw some nods, but I'm not sure it's because it was just after lunch or people were agreeing. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. The change analyzer? Yes. Yeah, so David Kelly's going to do a presentation on this and show you some demos. But if you're familiar with Solution Manager and you're, say, on the ABOP stack and classic SAP, what happens is you have transports, which are developers changing code, and then you can have SAP test scripts, or you can have Worksoft test scripts. And what happens is you associate a certified process, you load it into Solution Manager, and you associate it with an executable, like VL1, VLO1N. And then if you do what's called a semi-dynamic T-bomb, it would pick it up. But if you do dynamic T-bombs and certify, when you run certify from Solution Manager and you activate your work list with T-bombs active, it will do all the math in the background. And then when it picks the tests to run, it will pick your Worksoft tests along with your other tests inside of Solution Manager. So we actually have full loop integration there. Your other option is we can, because there's an Achilles heel in Solution Manager. They have no way to kick off lights out or automated tests. What I did for SAP and some other people is I wrote a certified process that goes to work lists and then runs them one at a time for them. But we can extract the change analyzer data and load it into our impact, and we can schedule the certified tests outside of there also through impact. So you have two ways, but we actually can be part of that workflow. Your automated tests can be of type certify, your T-bombs get picked up because they're associated with the executables, and then your change analyzer would say, run these certified processes or not. Okay. Yeah, so he used the D word. Is there a lot to maintain the data? Okay, I'm just going to say it. I would not maintain the data in Solution Manager because I am not that smart. Because there's system data containers, and then there's the data containers that move the data from Solman into there. And we have the best support for that in the industry. Richemont does it all the time. That is not for mere mortals. We always suggest that you create more of an end-to-end process. And when you run an end-to-end process, it actually, the T-bombs, dynamic T-bombs work, but we suggest maybe your first test sets up the data, your second test consumes it, and your third test then maybe clears it out, and you keep the data in record sets versus using the test data containers inside of Solution Manager. You can, it's fully integrated, you can do a right click and it pulls them down into there, but it's not for mere mortals. It is easier to maintain in record sets and have tests that string along, that create the data, consume it, and clean it up. So are the test scripts where? Uh-huh. Variants, yeah. And then, so your test scripts end up being scenarios, and then each certified test is a test step. So the variants are fine. You have your test steps, and the test steps are what you associate with the work list to run. So we're at the test step level. So there's actually it's a file new test, and when you've got configure for certify, it shows up your test step can be of type certify. And so that will work. And so David Kelly is, I think, showing that tomorrow in detail. So we actually have a specific presentation on Solution Manager integration, and I'll show how you do that, and that is tomorrow. It'll be in the room next door in the technical track. Okay? Yep. And there are some YouTube videos that Jill's did and I've done out there also. Any other questions? You ready to go start using analyze and capture and certify and this and go sprinting along the way? Yep. Cool. Well, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.